Hello. Welcome back to the CPA Mentor Center Resources webinar series, The Essentials of Coaching. Once again, I'm Stephen Friedman, and we're moving along to module number 4 of 6 around the essentials of coaching. This module is focused on coaching applications across multiple contexts, specifically around the tools and skills associated with effectively coaching our students at the CPA in the mentorship program. This is the first of 2 of the modules that will be focused on skills, specifically for coaching. And I'm looking forward to sharing, I think, some really wonderful ideas with everyone around some of the coaching skills. You'll begin to see there's a tremendous amount of overlap, even with some of the things we talked about in the last module, vis-a-vis higher order skills. Of course, some of the higher order skills that we're going to be trying to communicate as valuable for the careers of our coachees are also incredibly valuable for our ability as coaches to be effective in this program. So let's begin to take a look at what specific areas we're going to look at by examining the agenda for today's module. This module will be focused on basically 3 different sets of skills and what I sometimes call choices. The reason I call these choices is because I strongly believe in the ability of individuals, whether we're talking about your coachees or you in your skills as a coach and as a mentor. I strongly believe that we can acquire almost any of these kinds of skills. If we begin to think of this stuff as changing who we are to develop skills, then we won't be able to do it. I have a lot of people when I'm teaching about coaching who tell me, well, some of the things you're asking to do make a lot of sense, but it's not something that's in me to do. That's not my style. You can change your style. Your style is not who you are. You've already changed a tremendous amount in your life and in your career, and the acquisition of some of these skills in many cases is about the kinds of choices that we make rather than some sort of nebulous perspective on who we are as an individual. So we're going to be looking at specifically effective communication tools for coaches. Specifically, how do we make communication work? And of course, we're going to begin with the kinds of communications that are based upon goals. We're going to be looking at one of the more fundamental elements of having impactful communication, again, in any context, through the ideas of managing the perceptions that other people have of us. And finally, looking at one of the major challenges with effective and goal-based communication, and that being the inevitable ambiguity of some communications. Secondly, we'll spend some time looking at some really interesting choices that we may not have thought of around coaching, and that is, what kind of communication mediums should we be using? Should we be using electronic coaching, Skype, telephone, etc.? Or should we be focusing on in-person coaching? Or something in between? What is the ideal combination? What is a realistic way to look at the communication mediums that we're using for coaching? And of course, a part of this will be to take a little step back and start looking at the ways in which different types of communication mediums across contexts are either useful or not. We're also going to be, in the effort to introduce the next 2 modules, we're going to be spending some time looking at what are some of the essential communication frames or perspectives that we need to use for coaches. Again, getting back to the ideas of goals, but starting to think of goals less as ideas and more as behaviors. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. I want to back up a tiny bit and really spend some time thinking about what is it that makes communication effective in our coaching context, and quite frankly in a number of contexts. I'm reminded of some examples of things that I've seen in my work around, maybe you've encountered this before. You are in an organization, you're working on a project, and you need to send an important email to somebody about an element of this important project. Maybe there's a snag in the process. Maybe there's a delay in the way in which the project is moving along. And we tell the individual via email, let's say, that the project is not going as planned and there will be a delay. That is what we're saying to the person. And that might be the only thing that we write in an email. But the component of this hypothetical story that's important to think about is there a chance that somebody else might hear in that communication something other than what we intend to say? So if you write in a note, project is going to be delayed, maybe someone thinks you're being bossy. Maybe somebody hears that you're incompetent. Maybe somebody hears that you're lazy. Communication isn't about what we say to people. It's about what they hear. And if you can't say things in a way that allows people to hear them exactly in the way that you intend them to be heard, your communication will not be effective. And of course, the problem is we focus too much on what we say and not enough on what people hear, because we really do blame other people for misunderstanding. If people don't understand things the way we want in communication, as a coach or otherwise, we get frustrated. We tend to point the finger at them and say, they've misunderstood me. But in fact, you have not communicated effectively. Communication is not about what you express. It's about the other side of that expression. It's about what people hear. One of the more rich concepts that we spoke about in the last module was the idea of personal responsibility. And that touches this area as well. In other words, when we focus on what other people hear, as opposed to only what we say, we might be taking a little bit more personal responsibility for the outcomes of our communication. We need, one of the most essential components of being an effective coach is to take absolute responsibility for what is said and what other people hear. If you want to be effective as a coach and a mentor, the top of the list is communication effectiveness. It's right at the top of the list. And if we can't take responsibility for communication, what we're doing is we're giving away the control over the effectiveness of our communication to other people. If you want to make sure as a coach that someone understands the advice that you give, the perspective that you're offering, your take on a scenario, a situation, or a story, it is your job to make sure you communicate to that individual, not their job to listen. And at the minimum level, the most basic level, why is that the case? Because you are not them. You are you. That kind of mantra is fundamental to understanding what personal responsibility for communication effectiveness is about. One of the other things we begin to see, even again in the last module, when we look at the work of Daniel Pink, we look at the things like the skills associated with things like synthesizing ideas, something we talked about in the last module, conceptualization of ideas, relationships and rapport and referent power. One of the things we begin to understand is, sometimes, and perhaps more often than we think, process matters more than content. Something that's essential, actually, even in Daniel Pink's work as well. In other words, it really is, again, another one of these I mentioned earlier. I love expressions, and harkens back to an expression that my mom used to use with me. Maybe yours did too. You know what? Sometimes it's not what you say, it's how you say it. Sometimes it's not what you do, but how you do it. Maybe how we communicate to people is more important in many contexts than what we are communicating. We don't need to look very far to understand the strength of this approach. All we have to do is think about things like questions like, does a good idea, an innovative idea, always result in the implementation of that idea? The answer is no. There are lots of good ideas that don't get out there in the world. Why? People don't talk about them. They're not marketed properly. They're not communicated effectively. There is no audience. A person is too withdrawn or shy or insecure to express that idea. So again, it is not always the content of something that moves things along. Oftentimes it's the process. Maybe you've encountered this before in an organization, and that can be very frustrating for people. Sitting around a room in a meeting, and we say, I think this is a really great idea. We ought to do this because the thing you've been doing is wrong. People look at you perhaps with disdain and judgment, feeling like they're being judged by your criticism of their previous approaches. Maybe about 20 minutes later, somebody else expresses the same idea, but comes at it in a different way. Maybe they're more well-liked by the people that are in the meeting. They express that idea, and everyone around the room nods their heads in agreement. For a lot of us that are listening right now, this is an experience that you've encountered before. And we have to ask ourselves, we'll look at it and judge it and say, that's not fair. And you're right. It isn't fair. We can get to another parental expression. Talk about that, right? We've all heard it. Life's not fair. But really do have to ask ourselves, why is it that someone buys into one idea versus another? Maybe it's about the how. Maybe it's about the way that we expressed it. Maybe it's about the process that led up to it. Maybe it's about the kinds of words that we choose. Maybe it's about the tone that we're using. Maybe it's about our body language. Maybe it's about the process. Process is about making a distinction between the what and the how. Of course, the what is the data, the logical content and information that's contained in any communication. Like, I hate your shoes. The data in this expression is that you hate shoes and that perhaps, maybe, please don't wear those shoes anymore. But the question is, how will that be received by other people? If your goal or objective is to get that person not to wear those shoes anymore, telling them that the shoes are horrible, well, you tell me. You think about this. Do you think that will make that person not wear those shoes? I'm going to bet you it won't. The what is about the content, the information, and the data, the logical elements of communication. But what about the how? What about process? What about how we talk to each other? What about the ability of our data to influence other people? Something we talked about in the last module. What about the ways in which we act as opposed to the ways in which we express? What about the ways in which we work together as a team? How does that come to be? Maybe the how matters more than the what. And when we really consider the ideas around effective communication across contexts, coaching, workplaces, relationships, across the board, what makes for effective communication? You know, I'm reminded of a story that helps us really, helps my students and people that I work with really understand and really appreciate the difficulty and the challenges associated with effective communication. Let's say that we're working in an organization, and let's say, for argument's sake, it's a Thursday afternoon. And perhaps you, or someone you know, maybe your coachee or anybody, is working on a project with a colleague. Let's say that is either a peer or perhaps even an employee of yours. And everyone's well aware of the project, and we've been working on it for quite a bit of time, and everyone's well aware of what their responsibilities are, what the deliverables are for this project. That is not an issue in this story. On the Thursday afternoon, we decide that we're going to go and just finalize the delivery of this project. So we go to our employee or peer and we say, hey, you know that thing that we've been working on together? I need it on Monday morning at 9 o'clock on my desk in hard copy. Your component of this project. I have my component. I will bring my component to the fore and I will collate it and bring it to the boss, to whom I am accountable, at 9:15 a.m. on Monday morning. I must deliver this document to my boss 9:15 Monday morning. Let's just say, to make it more interesting and juicy, that this document impacts the funding for a component of your business for the next 5 years. So it's important. And it's a Thursday afternoon. It's not the last minute. So you say to your employee or your peer, Can you get it to me Monday morning, 9 o'clock on my desk? I'm accountable 9:15. Can you please do that? And of course, they say what almost everyone will say, even if it's not true, no problem. So, Monday weekend passes, Friday passes, weekend passes, Monday morning comes. You go to your office, 9 a.m., you look at your desk. And guess what? It's not there. Document's not there. We might even look and shuffle around our papers and look around the desk and pick things up. Can't find it. It's not there. So, in hearing this story, ask yourself, how would you feel? How would you feel in this moment? I bet you lots of you would feel things like frustrated, annoyed, disappointed, maybe even, depending upon the type of person you are, worried, beside yourself, nervous. But it is now 30 seconds after 9 o'clock. And of course, if you're anything like me, one of the more important things you've realized about the workplace is that all sorts of things happen to people. You never know what's going on in someone's life. Important not to make assumptions. So, in an act of understanding and infinite patience and kindness, you decide to give them a few minutes grace. Maybe you go use the washroom, make a phone call, come back to your desk at 9:05 and look at your desk for the document. Lo and behold, it's still not there. 5 minutes after 9. How do you feel now? Well, for anything like me, you just might want to add the word very in front of all the adjectives we used in the previous set of example. Very annoyed, very worried, very disappointed, very concerned. The first time around, though, it was our patience that kicked in. Of course, this time, perhaps it will be our intellect, our ability to solve problems. So we go on a mad search to find the employee, to find our staff member, to find the peer who has promised to leave this document on my desk Monday morning at 9 o'clock. It's a fruitful search, though, even though it takes a little bit of time, about 7 minutes. I'm moving around the organization. And finally, I happen upon an area that perhaps everyone has in their organization, the proverbial common area. Could be the water cooler, could be the coffee machine, could be a hallway, could be the coffee shop downstairs. And as we walk into that common area, we look across the room, maybe about 50 yards from us. We can see them. There's our peer. There's the employee. And what on earth are they doing? They are chatting it up with a friend about the weekend, having a good old time. Fascinatingly, as we see them across the room, you know the way it works. The happier they are, the more angry you become. So, we approach the person. We look them in the eye. What on earth do we ask them? We want to be effective communicators. We want to be able to achieve the goals and objectives that we have in this particular instance right now. Well, I've just told this story to hundreds of audiences in my workshops. And it's very interesting the kinds of responses that we get. So I'll tell you a little bit about the kinds of responses, and and of course, I would like for you to think about the kinds of questions that you might ask this individual as you approach them. Remember to put yourself in the position. You have been annoyed and worried and frustrated and disappointed. You have also been very annoyed, very worried, very frustrated, and very concerned. And as we're gelling on these emotions, we see them in the common area having a good old time, and we become incensed. Remember that this is where we're at emotionally. So we walk up to this person. What do we ask them? Well, perhaps we might ask them things like, and again, these are some of the most common questions. Where is the document? Or, why isn't the document on my desk? Why didn't you bring it to me? Or, when will you be getting this document to me? These are the kinds of things that perhaps someone who's a little more straightforward might ask. Some people who are perhaps a little bit less straightforward might ask things like, so, How was your weekend? Nothing more. Some people might ask things like, so, didn't we talk on Thursday about a document? They might ask, hi, so, what part of 9 o'clock don't you understand? These are some really solid questions that we might ask in this context. But we really do have to reflect. Using the model we talked about in the last module, double loop learning. And ask ourselves, what do you really want? What is your goal or objective in this interaction? Really great metaphorical story to help illustrate effective communication. What do you want? Well, I'm pretty sure you want the document. Have we asked for it in any of the questions that I previously mentioned? No. Where is the document? Is that the same as can I have it? No. When will the document arrive? Is that the same as can I have it? No. What's your problem? What's part of 9 o'clock don't you understand? Is that the same as can I have it? No. There's only one expression that is the same as can I have the document, and it is, can I have the document, please? But yet, infrequently do we think of such a response. We don't think to ask for what we want. We can add the magic word and make it nice, which of course is beneficial to your effectiveness. There's another example that I like to think of to illustrate this point. Think about a big dinner party that I have maybe at my house, and I've got 40 people coming to my home for dinner. A lot of work. And I might be looking across the table at the 39 people sitting at the table in front of me. There's a wonderful meal laid out before me. And I'm at the head of the table. And I've given up, there's a lot of delicious food items. And one of them is potatoes. Now, I don't know about you, but even though my mom always told me to taste them before I put salt on them, I usually want that salt. Interesting thing, though, is there's only one pair of salt and pepper shakers on the table. It's 20 seats down from me. What do you want? What do I want? I want the salt. Don't I? That's my objective. That's my goal. In my efforts to get the salt passed to me, do any of the following questions make any sense at all? When will the salt be here? Why isn't the salt in front of me? How was your weekend? Or my personal favorite, who the hell set the table? None of these things are going to bring the salt to you. There's only one thing that's going to bring the salt to you. May I have the salt, please? So we go back to the document story. And we think about it. What is it that makes it so difficult for us to really ask for what we want? To really focus on our goals when we're communicating? Well, there's a number of things. We're going to spend some time talking a little bit about what are some of the things that prevent us from being effective as communicators. And again, effective communication only means one thing. If I want you to pass me the salt, and the thing I do to get you to pass me the salt does not result in you passing me the salt, I have not been effective at the communication that says, can you please pass me the salt? You know, because you look in your hand and it's not there. That's what effective means. It means there's a state of affairs that exists. Something happens to make that state of affairs different than it was before and in a direction of a goal. If that does not exist, you have not been effective. This is fundamental to coaching. If you're going to be in a position where you're going to give advice to people and give input and ask people to your coachees to do takeaway activities, etc., in the context of coaching, if you're not effective, it's useless. So this concept we call goal-based communication. It's communication that is based upon a goal. What do you want? You know, some of the things that make this more complicated, I think, and we can see it in the document story, is there's a big difference between what I call venting, and certainly an idea that probably a lot of you are familiar with, versus asking for what it is that you want. Now, what is venting? Of course, we know what venting really is. The etiology of the term venting is about something that's under pressure and steam gets released much like an event. In psychology, of course, we call this catharsis, getting things off your chest. Now, very important, I don't want to give off the impression that venting and expressing yourself is a bad idea. It is not. It is a wonderful idea. But here's the thing. When you vent, when you tell someone you are frustrated and annoyed, and you communicate in that way by saying things like, what part of 9 o'clock don't you understand? What you're only doing is it's visceral. It's emotional. You're just expressing yourself. You're just venting. And venting can be very valuable. But don't have any illusions. Venting only brings you venting. Venting gives you the opportunity to vent. And you know what? Sometimes that's what you want. But I think a lot of times we haven't really sat down and reflected and said, is that really what I want? Is that really what my goal is, to vent to somebody? Or perhaps I actually want a solution. Perhaps I want that person to act differently. Perhaps I want to get them to do something. And what leads to our inability to really ask for what we want sometimes is emotion. That's why in the story, once we were frustrated, very frustrated, saw the person happy, sipping on their coffee, talking with their friend about the weekend, all those things lead up. Human beings are emotional. And we have a very difficult time controlling it. Self-control, personal responsibility for reaction. So instead, we vent as opposed to asking for what we want. And of course, we don't get what we want. When you look at some of the questions that people ask in that scenario, it's very interesting. We ask things like, when will it be here? Why isn't it here? When can I get it? These are all sort of finding out stuff. I don't know if in that scenario you really want to find stuff out. Actually, I think you want to get stuff. And finding out why a document isn't here does not put the document in your hand. And also, you got to really think about it. What's that conversation going to look like? If you say to somebody, why isn't it here? Do you think they're going to perk up and tell you why and actually produce the thing in 1 second? Or do you think they're more likely to be defensive? Defensiveness will ruin the effectiveness of your communication. One of the other things that happens is we don't really ask for what we want. Instead, we ask for what we don't want. Which, of course, doesn't work. You cannot run a race by knowing where the finish line isn't. You can only run it by knowing where the finish line is. It reminds me of something very funny that one of my students shared with me. It's kind of like what they call the negative shopping list. They give someone a shopping list, and on it says, don't get eggs, and don't get butter, and don't get milk. But can you please go shopping for me? Not helpful. So it's not about what you don't want. Thirdly, very interesting one, and I hear this a lot when I tell this story. People tell me, I shouldn't have to ask for the document. I asked them on Thursday. So I'm not going to go and say, hi, can I have the document, please? I'm going to ask all these other questions because I shouldn't have to ask for the document. It's not fair. Well, perhaps you're right. Perhaps it isn't fair that you have to. But you know what? You do have to. You know why? Because you don't have it. Effective communicators work harder at communication than people who are more ineffective. And if you're going to be looking at it in this way, you're never going to be the most effective communicator. And of course, my assumption in working with you guys through this module is that you want to be exceptional. You don't want to just be okay. You want to be awesome. And to be awesome, you have to do a little bit more. And it's not about what's fair and just. It's about the goal. If you want that document in your hand, you need to get it. Because I'll tell you, when you go to your boss at 9:15 to tell him that you don't have it, you tell me, do you think this will suffice? Hello, boss. I got good news and bad news. Bad news first. The document that secures our funding for the next 5 years, I don't have it. So we're screwed. Good news is I know why. Why is a terrible question. Why is a terrible question in moving forward towards goals? You know why? Why is a terrible question moving forward? Because it doesn't move forward. Why moves backwards. Why looks in the past, doesn't look in the future. It is not a tool to problem solve. If you're working in a manufacturing environment, you're an engineer, you're trying to figure out why a machine doesn't work, perhaps. But when you're dealing with people in the context of coaching, management, careers, the things that we're talking about, why goes back in time. You cannot move forward by moving backward. But lots of people think that you can. Why is not, in many contexts, is not a particularly useful question. Aside from the fact that it's inefficacious, people don't even know the answer. Reminds me of watching my sister parent her children. And, my niece, she's a young girl, 16, 17 years old. She spills her drink at the table. Everyone sort of stands up and looks at her, my sister included, and my parents, and they say, "Why did you spill your drink?" And I have to ask myself, how on earth can she answer that question? Because I'm a gangly, prepubescent teenager who can't control her limbs because I don't care about grandma's tablecloth. Even if she could determine the reason why, would knowing the reason why necessarily result in that drink not being spilled in the future? The answer is no. So maybe we don't need to ask why so much to be effective communicators. Maybe instead we need to think about actionable goals, things that people can actually act upon. Not why, but can you please? How do we get this goal-based communication happening? Well, I say it begins with planning. I say it begins with thinking carefully about what it is that we really want in an interaction. I like using a journal. We're going to be talking more, we have already mentioned it in one of the earlier modules, we're going to talk more about the idea of using a journal in the context of encouraging your coachees to use a journal for learning. Coaches need to use a journal too. In any context, a journal is such an amazing way to record and plan out how we're going to proceed with an interaction. We don't plan out our interpersonal communication. We improvise all the time. And although I get that time sensitivities and the realities of the workplace sometimes make it difficult for us to plan how we're going to communicate, I will say that the more tenuous the environment, the more challenging the situation is, the more meaningful it is. And certainly that's the case when you're going to be coaching your students, our students. Planning is crucial. But why don't we plan? I don't know. It's very interesting. All you got to do is think about someone, and maybe there's someone listening right now who likes to bake. Baking is a wonderful thing. Wish I could bake. Baking to me is alchemy, so I don't bake. I like cooking, though. But when I look at someone who's baking, it provides a wonderful metaphor for what we're talking about. So let's say you're someone who bakes. And let's say you bake from scratch one baking project per week. That would be on average about 50 baking projects per year, which, by the way, sounds delicious, especially if it's pie, cake. So let's say you bake 50 times a year. Think about the planning that goes into baking. You're going to have a recipe in front of you. You're going to have the ingredients that are required for that recipe. You're going to go to your cupboard. You're going to look for those ingredients. You're going to put them on the counter. You're going to plan out every element of the baking. You're going to make sure you have the proper measuring cups. You're going to be careful that you have the proper equipment, that you have all the ingredients that are required to bake effectively and be able to really get the outcome that you want. You might even have a photograph of what the darn thing's supposed to look like when you're finished. So here's something you do 50 times a year. Think about the planning. Conversations with people at work. 50 times a day. 100 times a day. No planning. Maybe we ought to reflect on this a little bit. Right? This is the kind of approach and way of thinking that can really help inform a really effective approach to coaching. The ability to focus on goals is a crucial skill for coaching. But, there's some problems associated with focusing on goals. And one of the problems has to do with the idea of ambiguity. What is ambiguity? Well, let's take a look at this image for a moment. Kind of fun. Not sure what you guys see here. But if you look carefully enough, you might see a rabbit. If you look even more carefully, you might see a duck. And if you look even more carefully, you might be able to see both. You might even be able to move them back and forth in your mind's eye. Look at it and see the duck, and then the rabbit, and the duck, and the rabbit. Well, how can a physical image that I'm looking at on a page be two things at one time? What is it that enables this image to be interpreted in multiple ways? The answer? Ambiguity. Ambiguity is a term that is used to describe something that we perceive in our environments through our senses that can be interpreted in multiple ways. And of course, I like to ask my students, what sorts of things that we perceive, stimuli in our environment that we hear and see and perceive with our senses is ambiguous? The answer, everything. Everything is ambiguous. Again, think back to the stuff we talked about with Daniel Pink. That's why conceptualization is so important. But when it comes to communication, this is particularly important because one of the interesting things that happens with ambiguity is the more ambiguous a perception is, the more likely the person who's perceiving it is to create meaning when in fact there may not be. We see this in examples like the Rorschach ink blot test, which perhaps some people have seen before. It's an old idea. Lots of people have seen these before. Interestingly, these are still tools that are used widely in psychiatry and psychology. And they're used to help understand people. This is a really interesting thing about ambiguity. Ambiguity breeds self-definition. The more ambiguous something is, a word, an idea, etc., the more likely we are to interpret it, but only from our perspective. That's what happens with ambiguity. Human beings hate ambiguity. So what we do is make things up. We create meaning where there isn't any. That's what happens when we look at a Rorschach ink blot test. Technically, this is actually called a projective test. In other words, the way in which you interpret it does not reveal anything about the image. But what it does reveal is something about you, your perspective. So, some people look at this and say, that is clearly an absolutely beautiful butterfly to symbolize spring and the coming of the summer, and it's just a beautiful butterfly floating up to the heavens with the bees to pollinate the world with love and joy. Somebody else might look at this image and say, no, that is a dark, ominous bat cloud of death that is coming to kill us all. Of course, it really depends upon your perspective. How could one image mean two different things? Or even more? Because it's ambiguous. And again, ambiguity creates self-definition, or what we call making stuff up. And this is problematic because what it does in the context of coaching and communication is create misunderstanding between people. That misunderstanding can impact relationships, and those relationships can impact both our effectiveness as a coach as well as our coachee's effectiveness as an employee. It creates misunderstanding. And never mind the images. Something we talked about in one of the earlier modules. Words matter. Let's take a look at some words for a moment. Let's see how ambiguity impacts our interpretation of them. One of my favorites, frequently or often. And as I like to say, I frequently use the word often periodically, from time to time, and every now and again. Of course, that's a joke. What does frequently mean? Let me say that, say perhaps I'm going to tell you I frequently drink coffee. How often do I drink coffee? Well, if you're somebody who drinks no coffee at all, and I say frequently, it's pretty wide open. It could be 1 coffee a day would be frequently compared to how much you drink, and 20 cups of coffee might be frequently compared to. So it could be wide open, anywhere from 1 to 20, if you don't touch the stuff at all. If, on the other hand, you're somebody who drinks 3 or 4 cups a day, and I say often, you might be thinking, holy cow, Friedman's got an intravenous going, and he's plugging the coffee down into his throat. Frequently or often is an ambiguous term. It doesn't mean anything without context. Let's look at some other ones that are probably more relevant to the kinds of advice or input you would give to a coachee. Respect. You might feel the need, based on interactions with your coachee, that one of the things they need to learn to do is to show more respect in the workplace to other people. It's a fundamental skill for liking and developing relationships. But what is it? Because interestingly, I might talk to one person and they would say to me, Stephen, to be respectful, what I need from people is for them to be frank with me, to be open, to shoot from the hip, to not dance around and walk on eggshells, and to be verbatim with me. Straightforward. Some people say that in order to garner respect, they want people to be very straightforward because they've got thick skin and they can take it and they don't want any kind of dancing around and ambiguous communication. So that might be in respect to person A. Interestingly, if we go and look at person B, Another individual might conceptualize respect in a very different way. That individual might say, you know what, respect to me means that you have to be careful how you speak to me. I don't want you to be frank with me. I want you to think about my sensitivity before you open your mouth. Think about the way in which it's going to be perceived before you speak to me. Who's right? Who's wrong? Well, we don't know. Because if we want someone to be respectful, maybe we got to stop using the word respect and start thinking about behaviors. Same thing with these other ideas. Better teamwork. What constitutes better teamwork? Does it mean less conflict? Does it mean more conflict? Does it mean a better way of solving conflict? Does it mean participation? What does it mean? Listening, too. Listening is an interesting one. What does listening mean? How do you show someone that you're listening? Is it about nodding your head? Is it about paraphrasing? Is it about asking questions? What creates listening? Again, all these sorts of goals that we might have for the development of our coachees, it might be so ambiguous that it makes us unable to communicate these ideas effectively to them. So, how do we manage ambiguity? Again, planning. We might have an idea that we want that individual to be more respectful, and we plan to go and talk to them about it in our next coaching session, but perhaps we need to sit down and do some planning around what are the real objectives. So what does it mean to be respectful? Maybe we want to be saying to them, hey, you know what's a good idea going forward? Maybe you might want to try to be careful to not interrupt people when you're in a meeting. Be careful, if you're going to criticize someone's ideas, be careful to speak to them outside of the context of the meeting and not in front of their peers so they don't get embarrassed. These are all behavioral things that we can plan out as opposed to just resorting to words like respect. And a big part of that also interactively is to throw it back to the other person that we're dealing with. Your coachee might say, my boss has told me to be more respectful. We might be asking them, okay, what does that mean to you? What does that look like to you? If you were respectful, how would you show that that's successful? Again, it's about moving from words and ideas to actions. It's about moving from concepts to behaviors. Asking questions is a really great way to manage ambiguity. Some of the questions I like to use are things like multiple choice questions, like, you said respectful. Did you mean this or this? Or, again, to paraphrase. So what I'm hearing is this. Is that correct? Am I understanding that word correctly? You know, the words that we use in coaching are not the end of a conversation. Like respect is not the final word. It's the beginning of the conversation. Respect is an important thing to try to emphasize to our coachees. But using the word itself is just the beginning of being able to coach them towards being more respectful. The end is our discourse around what the heck things like respect actually mean. The other area I want to focus on today is about the idea of managing perceptions. Very important part of your effectiveness as a coach. Of course, your ability to get people to buy into your suggestions comes, as we learned in the last module, often through rapport and relationships and referent power. But an important part of being able to do that is to make sure that you have those positive relationships. And a big part of that is about making sure that you are seen in a positive light and being in control of the way other people perceive you. The challenge is, though, that perception equals fact. What does this mean? This means that if somebody thinks that you're difficult, guess what? You're difficult. Whatever other people see in you is what you are. Human beings are social. And who we are is defined by the people around us. So if the people around you that work with you think that you're difficult to work with, you are difficult to work with. Managing perceptions is your job, not somebody else's. If somebody views you in a way that you don't want them to view you, don't debate it. You've probably seen this before. I'm not difficult to work with. I am not yelling. Doesn't work. Don't debate it. Address it. Don't prove it. Address it. How? Ask. Hey, I'm aware that seems like perhaps things aren't going as well as they could, and perhaps we don't have the kind of interaction that we want. I would like to fix it. How can I do that? Again, be a student of other people to manage perceptions. If you don't like the way someone's seeing you, change it. This is a tough and tricky thing to talk about because this has to do with the choices that we make and the way we communicate in coaching. Now, I'm well aware that there are challenges around finding the right medium due to our availability, busyness, geographical disparity that makes it difficult for us to always meet face-to-face with our coachees. But I do want to talk a little bit about it. There's a wonderful series of research around the mediums for communication. It's called media richness theory. And it basically says that there is differences among the information carrying capacities of different communication mediums. In other words, telephone, email, synchronous, asynchronous, face-to-face, video chat, all these things carry different levels of information. And the quality of the communication that we use is affected by the richness of that medium that we're using to communicate. Thirdly, the degree to which information is synchronous between senders and receivers is the most important impact on our conversations. In other words, synchronous means at the same time. The extent to which both parties can receive things like nonverbal and paraverbal cues impacts our relationships and the effectiveness of our communication. Nonverbal we know, right? Nonverbal has to do with things like sitting forward and sitting back, looking open and looking closed, closing our eyes, etc. Paraverbal has to do with things like the tone of voice that we use, our intonation, the kinds of signals that tell whether someone's being sarcastic, whether they're making a joke, whether they're being serious or not, lighthearted or not. These paraverbal cues do not come through in various forms of communications. And all the emoticons you want to add won't do it. So, what are some of the takeaways from this idea of media richness? Well, face-to-face is the richest medium and the most effective medium for communication. Asynchronous media, remote media, are the least rich, and as a result of this, the least effective forms of media for communication. So in terms of the richness and goodness of communication mediums, it sort of goes in this order. Number 1, face-to-face. Number 2, telephone. Number 3, Skype and video chat. Number 4, instant messaging. And lastly, at the bottom, the least effective form, which is not really permitted for this coaching program, is email. Skype, face-to-face, teleconference, these things only approximate face-to-face. They are not ideal for important communications. Now, before I get into this, I do want to note that the reality is that we will not be able to always meet face-to-face with our coachees. But I think what I'm really saying is number 1, endeavor to make all of your interactions with your coachees face-to-face. It is the best way to maintain honesty, openness, relationship, clarity, to eliminate misunderstanding, ambiguity, to maximize interaction, relationship, face-to-face. But I realize, again, that is not possible all the time. So what I am going to suggest is that, at the minimum, you make your first 1 or 2 sessions face-to-face. Once you have some level of rapport, you can move on to things like telephone would be my personal second preference, and then things like Skype. I really do think that telephone is better than video conferencing, and I'll talk a little bit about it. These things lack the benefits of face-to-face, things like Skype and FaceTime and teleconferencing, even though, again, it's okay to use them. And I think, again, telephone is the best next to face-to-face. So one of the things that can impact the goodness of face-to-face and telephone communication is this idea called recordlessness. Recordlessness is a really interesting idea. What it means is that when there is not a million people watching and there isn't some recording or record of your communication, either because someone's watching or because it's being recorded or because it's on the internet, people are more open and honest. Right? When you close the door, face-to-face discussion, meet a coachee in a coffee shop or wherever you're going to meet them, and you talk to each other, there is no record of your discussion. It enables people to be more open. It enables more confidentiality, more disclosure of ideas. more likelihood to admit, for the coachee to admit that they're doing things wrong, the kinds of things that you need for them to learn and grow. When you do it on the internet, people are aware of the fact that, as we all know, once it's on the internet, it lives there forever. Right? Once it's in an email, it lives there forever. So the anonymity that comes in the casual nature, the length of time that we can speak, problems with eye contact, all these things are problematic in FaceTime, teleconference, Skyping types of communications. Eye contact problems are hopefully we can overcome them, because Skype can be good, almost as good as telephone, but we need to start moving away from some of the challenges. One of the big ones is it's sort of hard to explain unless you're actually looking at a computer like I am right now. The top of your computer has a camera. And in order to make eye contact with people that you're Skyping with, you need to look at their eyes. But the problem is, when you look at their eyes on your monitor, they don't see you looking at your eyes, because their eyes are the camera. And you look at the eyes on the screen. The perception of the person on the other end of Skype is that you're not looking at them. And that subconscious perception impacts honesty, openness, effectiveness of communication, and connection between human beings. Somebody told me a really cool idea, which is if you're doing a lot of Skyping, go to a little magazine and cut out the eyes of a picture and get some tape and stick it up on the camera of your laptop, so that when you're Skyping, you're actually looking at the camera, so that the person on the other end can see and perceive that you're looking at their eyes. One of the other things that happens on camera is the artificial posture. If you've ever been to a wedding or an event where a photographer helps you in poses, and sometimes you may have experienced this, and they put you in a pose and you feel it looks really awkward. It feels awkward. You think, why would that photographer, tweak and put my body in that way? I don't think it will look good. But then you go and you look at the pictures afterwards and you think, oh my God, it felt uncomfortable and weird, but it actually looks great, right? So without a lot of counsel on posture, we tend to, on Skype and teleconferencing, we tend to look very squared and sort of stiff because of the way we sit in our seats. And that is something that actually has an impact on the way in which we communicate in some of these other less ideal forms of communication. Problems with nonverbal communication. And of course, yes, technologically advanced world, but some of these things are technologically connection dependent. So if you're doing Skype or teleconference and the technology isn't working, there's a weird echo, there's glitches in the technology coming in and out, it can really be distracting from the purpose of that interaction. We've probably seen this in meetings as well in our work. So, that closes out Module 4. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of the next steps we're going to be looking at in our next module. We're going to be looking at furthering our discussion around the kinds of things that create effectiveness of communication and coaching by looking at rapport and relationship development in more detail. And learning about what are some of the tools that coaches can use to develop better rapport and relationships with our coachees, and as well as what are some of the ways in which we can teach these concepts to our coachees as a higher order skill. Secondly, how can we set up norms and rules to enable the effectiveness of our coaching relationships with our coachees? Thirdly, how does social and emotional skills help coaches in their ability to be effective coaches? And how can we use an understanding of these skills to teach them to our coachees as well? And lastly, what are some ideas around the logistics, timing, and a model for the process of coaching? So we'll be looking at that in Module 5. Thanks again for listening.